Minister, it's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. Your government has recently made a deal with Mexico to better protect migrant workers, but this deal comes too late for 3 migrant workers who have now died of COVID-19 and hundreds of others who are battling the virus in poor accommodations. Do you feel that the Canadian government has failed these workers?
We brought in strong measures around mandatory quarantines for arriving temporary foreign workers and have rules in place that protect those workers. Obviously, there are cases in which those rules were not followed, and we are extremely concerned by that, and there will be consequences for companies that did not follow the rules designed to protect workers in Canada. In Canada, anyone doing work, let alone essential work as part of our food chain, needs to feel protected. Obviously, in the case of these 3 tragic deaths, that wasn't the case, and we are ensuring that changes are made and that there will be consequences.
Workers now, news of a 3rd death on the weekend of a 55-year-old man. So there are 3 migrant workers that have died, and we're going to talk to someone in just a moment, but wanted to get you both to weigh in on that as well, because obviously, the admission from the Prime Minister that something was not done right here, that it was, that I don't know if he said rules were broken.
He wants to make sure the rules are followed, and that it appears they haven't been.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
Yeah, the same thing stuck out to me, Rosie, as well, because I've done a number of interviews the past few weeks about this. 3 migrant workers have now passed away. Windsor, for example, I think the announcement was just made that they're being held back from moving into the next stage of reopening, primarily because of the outbreaks in communities in which migrant workers work right now in the Windsor area. This 3rd worker who passed away, and I'm so sorry, I don't have the name of his name on the tip of my tongue, but you had it earlier, Rose.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. He worked near Simcoe, so not in the Windsor area, but there have been a lot of conversations between, for example, public health officials in the Windsor area, the mayor of Windsor, a lot of concern from, of course, advocate groups around this as well. And so far, the government, until Mexico said that they were no longer going to send any, they're putting a pause basically on sending any temporary foreign workers here. There certainly wasn't a huge amount of acknowledgement from the federal government that something had gone really wrong with the processes that were in place. To be fair to the feds, they did put up a lot of money. I think it was about $50 to $60 million to enable people to properly self-quarantine when they had to and to isolate themselves. I think it was $1,500 per employee wherever the employer had the necessity to quarantine people. So there was a lot of money allotted to that. But the big complaint I heard, especially from advocate groups, was around inspections. And that's why these comments from the Prime Minister really stuck out to me around the rules not being adequately followed. My understanding is a majority of those inspections, and there have been more than 500, as of a few weeks ago, more than 500, were conducted virtually. So there was a lot of concern from the workers and from the advocate groups about the efficacy or the accuracy of those inspections. Of more than 500 inspections that were completed, 0 they call them non-compliances, but basically no employer was found to be breaking the rules. There were 0 there's a possibility of punishment, but no penalties were levied. No one was found to be in non-compliance, was exactly, I think, how the Minister of Immigration put it to me at the time. That is again, very interesting to me, because if the problem is about not following the rules and you're not showing in your inspections that anyone isn't following the rules, which is, by the way, what these workers were flagging to the advocacy groups at the time, then there seems to me to be a problem with the inspection process. So my follow-up questions for the government are certainly, what are you going to do to boost the accuracy and the depth to which these inspections take place? And do you acknowledge that the ones that have been conducted so far don't meet the standards that you need to have going forward in order to kind of make good on this promise to ensure that everyone is following the rules and to really mitigate the spread of the virus or lessen it, because as we've seen, that these communities are being hit really hard, and there's a host of other questions, a lot about permanent residency and the way in which these workers are treated in the first place. But I think zeroing in on the idea of ensuring better compliance with the rules certainly, I think, generates some questions about the process that's currently in place.
And where this last gentleman, Mr. Chaparro, died, there are more than 200 positive cases in that area, in that farming operation. So obviously, obviously the measures aren't in place to make sure that people are well protected, David.
Yeah, virtual inspections. We also saw another trouble spot in this country inspected remotely, and that was long-term care homes in Ontario. As our colleague David Common and his team reported, a lot of long-term care homes were inspected over the phone rather than in person. So you may be able to telecommute. It is very difficult to tele-inspect, especially critical things such as seniors' care and food production. And when the Prime Minister said that rules weren't followed on things like work conditions and living conditions, not followed by who? Not followed by the workers, not followed by the employer, not followed by both. Will there be accountability for these particular failures? It's interesting, too. It reminds me a little bit of the meat packing and the meat processing story that we saw in places like Alberta, where it's similar things, right? People pack together in a contained space to work, and then often living in a communal living situation where there's a lot of people in really a smaller than desirable space at the best of times, and certainly during the time of a respiratory viral pandemic. So I'm curious to see how they change that. There was money provided, as Vashi outlined, up front for people to self-isolate and people to quarantine and people to do these things. And there's a need to put resources at this to make sure it's done right because of the dependency, obviously, we have on our domestic food supply in a time of global trade disruption. But what do they do now? I mean, do they provide extra housing? Do they provide extra inspections? Right. The numbers are quite high if you look at it. It's bigger than some Atlantic provinces, for example, just in some of these places. So the next steps are going to be vital on this too.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. I'll come back to you if you don't mind. Let me go now, though, to Karen Koch. She's the Projects and Campaigns Coordinator for Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, an organization that fights for justice and dignity for migrant workers. And Karen has spoken to the families of the workers who have died from COVID-19. Karen, thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rosemary.
So I don't know if you've spoken to Mr. Chaparro's family. I know he's left behind a wife and 4 kids. Maybe you can just give me a sense of how they're doing.
Yeah, I have been in contact with the family. They are, as to be expected, totally devastated. They are grieving. They are in shock. Mr. Chaparro had been ill for some time and had not been able to be in contact with his family in recent days. And they are shocked that someone who had been coming to Canada for 10 years to work, to provide income as the main breadwinner for their family, will not be returning home this season alive.
Yeah, I mean, it's devastating to have 3 deaths, but hundreds and hundreds of cases. We heard the Prime Minister, Karen, talk about how rules weren't followed. And you maybe heard Vashi there talk about virtual inspections. Is anything being done to mitigate the spread of the pandemic? Because it does seem to be sort of spinning out of control on about 17 Canadian farms at this stage.
I think we've heard a lot about the housing conditions and the working conditions on farms for migrant farm workers and how they really provoked the massive spreading like wildfire of this disease on farms. But on the question of rules, I think we need to be very clear that the vast majority of the housing and working conditions that migrant workers on farms are living and working under are actually perfectly legal. The problem is not that people are not following the rules. The problem is that the rules are bad. Workers told us before they even arrived in Canada when COVID-19 hit that they were afraid to come to Canada to work because they knew that their housing and working conditions would put them at extreme risk of exposure and of illness and possibly death. And they know, migrant workers know, that they cannot raise concerns about their housing and working conditions without risking termination, which means they risk all of their income, which means they risk deportation and potential blacklisting from the program and returning to Canada in future. This is because workers do not have permanent status in this country. And so anytime they raise concerns about their working and living conditions, they can be deported. And workers, every single worker that we have spoken to at farms where there are outbreaks, have said to us from the get-go, they know that they cannot speak up about conditions that they knew would put them at risk, about the lack of PPE, about the crowded housing conditions, about the extreme overwork, because they know what happens to them. They get terminated, they get deported, and then they can't come back, and their families depend on this income. So the question is not whether or not rules are being followed. The question is that the program is built to keep workers temporary, and that provides all of the power, that puts all of the power in the hands of employers and no power in the hands of workers to be able to protect themselves from preventable situations like what we are seeing right now.
So Mexico had, of course, suspended sending workers to Canada because it was concerned around this, and then I guess got some reassurances from the Employment Minister, Carla Qualtrough, from the government around things that the federal government would do to try and secure the conditions and make sure that these people are better protected. What do you make of that decision then to allow workers to come back and the federal government's commitment to try and do better?
Well, we've heard nothing from the Canadian government about the question of permanent residency. And we know that that fundamentally is the problem here. Workers know that that is the problem here, which is why workers have been demanding permanent residency for years now, to be able to address their inability to raise concerns about bad living and working conditions and leave bad jobs. And we know that the agreement that the Mexican and the Canadian government came to has said things about doing more inspections. It has access to workers to complain. But fundamentally, if workers do not have the stability and the security to be able to stay in this country and continue to work, they will not be able to effectively raise concerns about bad living and working conditions. And employers will continue to have a green light to ensure that workers are producing the maximum amount of output in the minimum number of conditions with the worst working conditions.
I get that might be the long-term outcome, but given that isn't going to happen overnight, is there anything short-term that could be done to better protect people, in your view? Better housing, giving them hotel rooms, I don't know, something that's obviously not going to resolve the problem but could help.
I mean, it actually is a short-term solution. We've seen that the Canadian government responded to the issue of asylum seekers working in healthcare in Quebec who are being exposed to COVID-19 to provide a pathway to permanent residency. We are saying that actually immediate permanent residency for migrant workers is the fastest and the most effective way to be able to provide workers the ability to protect themselves, to denounce bad working conditions and living conditions, put pressure on employers to improve the kinds of jobs that they provide and leave those bad jobs. Access to better housing, access to better health care, all of these things are vitally important in this situation, but they do not address the fundamental problem that workers simply do not have the power and do not have the choice to protect themselves or to access any of those better conditions so long as they can be deported at a moment's notice for having done so.
The workers that you're talking to, the ones that are still going to work every day for the reasons that you've outlined there, how concerned are they that they're going to get sick? Because clearly hundreds have gotten sick.
They are very concerned. They are very concerned for their health. They are concerned for what happens to their families as the breadwinners if they get sick and can't work. They are concerned about the money that they have lost by having to be in quarantine. They are very concerned and they are devastated by these deaths. Workers are devastated by these deaths. These are their coworkers. These are people they shared bunkhouses with. They are devastated and they are very afraid. And they know that their employer has complete power over them and that there is nothing that they can do to change their circumstances until the government gives them access to the power to be able to do so. And so people are going back to work very afraid, knowing that this added scrutiny on farms is making employers scrutinize workers even more. So it's actually exacerbating the power imbalances that exist and making it even more difficult for workers to raise concerns about what's going on.
Okay. Karen Koch, thank you for making the time on this, such an important topic. Appreciate it. Karen Koch is the Projects and Campaigns Coordinator for Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Should tell you that Canadian farmers rely on about 60,000 short-term farm workers, mostly from Latin America and Caribbean countries, to come in and help with the planting and harvesting in this country. So again, as we've seen sort of with long-term care centers,